Dr. Jan. Sorry, I had to switch off the recording in progress note. Because yes, please do take note that there will be a recording made as usual and put up on our website. So I was just saying, so I'm the director of this center. And today's speaker is Dr. Jan Gobernak, who I know quite a few of us know. He's now a lecturer in political sociology at Newcastle University. His research is concerned with policymaking and knowledge production in the field of post-immigrant integration and citizenship. He's interested in the interaction between state regulation and disruptive agency, and in the development of policy agendas that aim for social unity and cohesion. For example, he has a book out in the Palgrave series on citizenship and politics of identity called The Politics of Social Cohesion, which is a comparative study of Germany, France, and the UK in terms of their discourses on social cohesion earlier in the century. Before joining Newcastle, Jan has held fellowships at the European University Institute Robert Schuman Center, and at this center and in this school, and that's why, of course, so many of us do know him. He worked on the EU 7th framework project, Accept Pluralism, with me and John Fox, who I know is in the room, as it were, also worked on that project. And Jan and I edited a book out of that project, which I've got here, entitled Tolerance, Intolerance, and Respect, Hard to Accept. I should just say finally that the current talk sets the scene for a book project on social imaginaries of crisis. So welcome, Jan, or welcome back indeed. And it's a shame that we couldn't do it in person as we were kind of hoping to, but I know you will be coming to Bristol for another event that we're having in September. So some of us will see you. We'll see you then. But in any case, welcome to this online seminar, and I hand over to you, so you may say hello and begin.
Hello. So it's very, very nice to well, let's not call it see you, but I mean to sort of witness the presence of so many of you in this room, and see a couple of familiar people and names that I recognize. Well, I mean, firstly, thanks for the invitation, Tarek. And I agree, it would be nice to have come up to down rather to Bristol, because I do remember these ethnicity center seminars, which often were really excellent. Now, I don't claim for my presentation to be excellent, but I, even in the case of sort of, you know, half decent presentations, there was usually the post-talk conversation over a glass of wine, which tended to be always a highlight. So we're missing out on that, which is a shame. But in any case, I look forward to talking to you. Let me just share my screen, and let me start. Now, the concern that I'm speaking to today comes out of an interest in the politics of multiculturalism. So going back to my work at the Ethnicity Center, and this is a concern with multiculturalism's political circumstances, especially with various claims about the currency or fate of multiculturalism as a paradigm, and the idea that multiculturalism is in crisis. I was always a bit uncertain and maybe befuddled by such claims, not just by the status of sort of multiculturalism as an idea in crisis, but also at the possible range of responses to any such argument. I mean, certainly there are scholars who show the endurance of multicultural arrangements, their compatibility with certain liberal democratic frameworks or kind of nation state specific paradigms. And I'm not sort of never quite sure what the current fate of multiculturalism is. And I thought it'd be good to start off with that and with sort of some work that I did for the better part of 20 minutes, putting together the following graph. So this is sort of me going to Nexus, not Nexus actually, and looking for combined hits between multiculturalism and then sort of collection of keywords, death, demise, crisis, and looking at English language news since from 1995 till 2021. This is an extremely unsound graph for a number of reasons, but I still wonder how it can be read. I mean, maybe perhaps for where the anti-multiculturalist peak lies, whether there is a dip in sort of discourses around the crisis of multiculturalism following 2016, perhaps. Is that a sign that we've moved beyond the crisis of multiculturalism because maybe better arguments have won, or because multiculturalism just simply is no longer in crisis? But it's also that the crisis of multiculturalism as an idea has been displaced by alternative ideas that are subject to attack, such as identity politics or wokeness. Maybe it's that political objectives have shifted, and that the intended effects of declaring multiculturalism to be in crisis have been achieved in the different political environments in which such declarations have been made. So I have no idea if any of these possible explanations in relation to this very flaky, unsound graph makes any sense. And it's probably not a good idea to speculate either. But I would say that our inability to read this graph and to make sense of the crisis of multiculturalism more generally, to connect it to anything that would be real or substantive, is maybe a symptom of something broader that requires analysis. It points towards something that I want to explore in this talk in relation to the concept of crisis in claims, such as the one that multiculturalism is in crisis. So I won't be talking about the domain of multiculturalism in any detail in the following, but I do want to follow up on quite a few sort of points about the concept of crisis, what crisis proclamations do, how they arrange political spaces, how they mobilize publics, and how they, and I know that is quite a mouthful, how they create social worlds. So this is supposed to be a self-contained paper, but as Tarek already mentioned, it's also meant to go into a longer piece of work where I'm following up on crisis as a descriptive, analytical, narrative tool. So I'm chewing through quite a bit of stuff here, and some of it at a fairly high level of abstraction. For this, I do apologize, although I hope that it also provides maybe the occasion for sort of challenges from anyone here in the audience, and maybe elaborations that sort of, allow me to see whether sort of these ideas work in practice. Drawing on quite a bit of stuff that comes from recent British and American, US politics, but I'm also reference French and German circumstances occasionally here. Okay, I want to comment on the use of crisis and make really the argument or case for three positions. First one is that crisis is productive. It makes populations visible, suggests dramatic or tragic storylines, may create a sense of historical order, and can suggest entry points for political intervention. At the same time, employments of crisis are often routinized, repetitive, and scriptive. And crisis knowledge is often fairly banal, relying on common sense understanding and combinations of existing themes and images that experience wide-ranging circulation. That is certainly the case for sort of the far-right politics of crisis and the way in which some of the relevant themes sort of, appear in the mainstream as well as sort of on the far right. Now, I've been thinking about how to illustrate these two arguments to make them a bit more tangible. And there's a brilliant essay by Susan Sontag from the 1960s called The Imagination of Disaster that I find extremely useful for this purpose. So Sontag reviews the cinematic production of the 1960s, in particular the theme of apocalypse, in various horror and alien invasion movies. So it's about amazing thrills, fantastic sights, or here, different poster. The incredible becomes real, the impossible becomes fact, the unbelievable becomes true. And she offers a commentary on this genre of films, which I really enjoy for how it puts together a couple of things. First of all, the banality of the films, their perpetuation of cliches about identity, volition, power, knowledge, happiness, and so on. And which he then sort of puts together as an argument about the unremitting banality, which coincides with the inconceivable terror of cinematic production of the 1960s. And for me, there is something there, something to be gained by looking at crisis or the use of crisis. Its ubiquity, its scripted and banal character along similar lines as a spectacle. That's part of my argument, a useful way of looking at different genres of popular writing and academic scholarship about crisis that creates a spectacle out of crisis. And that will also be partially what I'm doing in this paper, to make an argument for that particular perspective. But let me sort of go back to my proposal here and what I want to argue in this paper. Because the final point I want to make is that understanding crisis in this way provides a productive view on sort of something around the circulation of sort of ideas of civilizational crisis on the far right and into the mainstream, but that's not really the concern I have here. Instead, I want to say something about the political visibility of society, social groups and social relations through the employment of crisis. So I will unpack this argument in three different steps. I will offer a comment on different literatures that employ crisis, genres of crisis work. I then want to flesh out the idea of crisis work, so make my own conceptual suggestion, sort of on the basis of existing ideas and social theories of crisis. And then offer some comments also on how crisis in very embodied, concrete UK policy settings structures the political space. Just one more thing by way of a preface before I kind of get into sort of the substance of the talk. What underpins all of this in some ways is an unhappiness on my part with the political and sociological perspectives on crisis that employ crisis that are available, which tend often, not always, but quite frequently, treat crisis as an independent variable, as a background condition that explains certain forms of behavior, electoral choices, resentment. And I want to make a case for crisis as an active category, as something that needs to be put into the practice, into our sort of, sociological, political analysis for how it's made and remade. And then relatedly, also questions around authorship and authenticity and the way in which crisis as a frame puts marginal groups into particular perspectives as subjects of crisis. So this is where I'll try to get to towards the end. I want to start off just with a few comments on the proliferation of text, covering different subjects, different groups, different experiences, which employ crisis, which try to give an account of critical experiences. And I was just sort of, really looking at a couple of key books published over the past couple of years that allow me to sort of sketch out sort of some of these different genres of crisis work that are out there. Now, in terms of the crises of immigration, obviously there's a lot that can be said about constructions of the refugee crisis. I'm particularly interested in sort of the construal of immigration crises with regards to European immigration into the United Kingdom in the run-up to Brexit and following from then. Because there is sort of this interesting duality of crises constructions available, one of which centers the experience of European citizens in the aftermath of Brexit, and the experience of, as Louise Ryan calls it, disembedding, feeling of betrayal, of rejection, and also obviously quite a bit of output in pages of The Guardian, and for example, also in this book, In Limbo, collecting the experience of European citizens as they were being unsettled. But the interesting sort of coincidence of that argument is obviously with publications, with books like David Goodhart's The Road to Somewhere, which takes sort of similar experiences and process them as a very different crisis of immigration, one in which the ambivalence of European citizens, their lack of commitment to this country, is kind of considered to be a crisis for the nation. I will get back to these points. Now, quite clearly, this ominous subject of the left behind, which can be made visible in so many different ways, whether it's with reference to deindustrialization, elite betrayal, or cultural modernity, is an extremely productive space of crisis production. I mean, we're all familiar with themes here. Most importantly, for my purposes, there's something here in terms of the construction of the left behind and different kind of genres of work, which highlights pathologies, but also sort of speaks of hope and redemption. So offers moral evaluations that sort of are often quite ambivalent or go in all kinds of directions. So David Goodhart speaking of the fundamental decency of somewheres and somewheres institutions, or somewheres being those sort of traditional, locally settled British citizens who experience discomfort with cultural modernity and with immigration and many other things. But it's also something that can be found in a number of, genres of production, of textual production in different national contexts. I mean, particularly sociologies of the periphery, sometimes even just travel reports of Didier Eribon in France going to Reims, to the kind of northeast, or German metropolitan dwellers going into sort of East Germany and sort of, giving an account of how fundamentally flawed, but also fundamentally decent sort of the people they encounter are. I will get back to some of that, as I've already mentioned, in a minute. And then something that some of us are very familiar with, obviously, the way in which Muslim life and Islam are considered to be in crisis, and the portrayal of Muslims, I mean, often with certain metaphors of distance, various dimensions of separateness, the idea of the takeover, demographic anxieties that exist alongside a spectrum ranging from the issue of self-segregation, leading up to replacement fantasies, which also include, which I find quite interesting, from commentary from so-called critical insiders, right? So Sarah Khan, the recent counterterrorism czar and now still sort of high-ranking advisor to the conservative government, who speaks about of Muslim distance and sort of cultural pathologies. So that particular discourse of crisis of Muslim life and the idea of distance, obviously, sort of is often processed at the same time as a crisis of permissive liberalism, right? As a crisis where Muslims are to some extent just a placeholder for pathologies within liberalism and its inability to lay down the line to sort of, those pesky Muslims. So the kinds of civilizational narratives that quite strong in, say, Douglas Murray's work, but have a strong resonance in the mainstream as well. So just to give a bit more substance to some of this, but I don't want to linger too much, so see, kind of time is flying. just picking out sort of three random texts, not random texts, three texts that I think embody some of these ideas of crisis, and I was kind of thinking about how to put them through some analytical lens and with regards to experiences of crises. David Goodhart's work and Sarah Kahn's work, and sort of in the way in which European migrants become subjects of crisis and articulate their crisis experiences. And there are just a few dimensions that I think are worth of highlighting here with regards to crisis experiences that are foregrounded, the importance of certain moral truth that such accounts tend to put center stage, the underlying decency of somewheres. I've already mentioned that. The potentials in sort of Muslim life in Britain to be aspirational, positive, and thoughtful, if only certain obstacles are overcome. The connections that European citizens have forged and have put at risk. Causes stories of crisis, elite betrayal, the harm of identity politics. And that's sort of the one of the key features I will get to in this talk, certain claims about relational dispositions. So the way in which the behavior of European migrants, according to Goodhart, sort of is seen with resentment by those somewheres who, hold a grudge against the treatment of the country as a temporary economic convenience, but also the way in which sort of relationships are suggested and thought with through crisis for different groups. Okay, I don't want to get more mileage out of this this particular slide, because I will get back to some of these sort of ideas and try to sort of put them together in a more clear-cut analytical framework. But what I do want to do now is change tracks a little bit and sort of ask the question about how available social diagnostics of crisis allow us to make sense of some of these ideas that are in circulation. So what are the tools that we have to grasp crisis? I want to outline just 4 tendencies here, but I will linger in particular on sort of the political dimension later. Firstly, it is probably worth saying that not just in kind of leftist social political sociology and historical sociology in this country, the category of crisis has been incredibly productive, has been used in so many different ways over time, and sort of has really held together sort of paradigms of sociological scholarship. Clearly in the Marxist tradition, where the idea of the unspooling of base structural processes that then experience sort of contradictions, question of structural necessity and political contingency, and the viability of political and economic models, of very deliberate efforts to respond to the 28 crash and suggest ways of understanding that and drawing on the notion of crisis. But equally, and at the same time, historicist ideas of crisis, Reinhard Koselleck's Kritik und Krise, that traces the birth of critique and the experience of crisis to this confrontation between the emerging bourgeoisie and the absolutist state, so looking very much into the 18th century and the Enlightenment, which creates a kind of distinction between morality on the one side and politics, opening up a space for crisis, but also, and that's quite important, so creates an awareness of historical time for Koselleck. So the idea of progress comes into this picture, and Walter Benjamin clearly with this comment on sort of the experience of cultural modernity and the consciousness of being in the middle of crisis comes in here at the same time as that Janet Breutmann's work, which is quite good. Structuralist accounts of crisis, drawing on Habermasian, Luhmannian systems theory, where the stability of systems, their ability to serve certain functions, to coordinate. Sylvia will be coming in with sort of an idea of complexity theory here. all of which is just sort of to set the scene briefly, to say sort of, there is a productive space of sort of theorizing crisis for different purposes and trying to make use of it to understand sort of society as it presents itself to us. Now, but what I want to highlight over the other tendencies is a certain political tradition that is particularly pronounced in the UK. And that is partially to do, I suppose, with the way in which Gramsci's work, Antonio Gramsci's work, has been received starting from the 1960s in the UK. So the tradition here is a powerful idea of kind of analyzing cultural forces, hegemonic ideas, political openings, which really, in the UK has been sort of the dominant model for thinking about the 20th century among sort of leftist social analysts, looking at the ups and downs of the labor movement. And in this work, crisis, usually sort of our crisis or our present crisis, is really the central category that holds these ideas together. And I think it's worth just unpacking a couple of these contributions in a bit more detail. Now, Perry Anderson's work is interesting here for some way the early reception of Gramsci, but also for sort of really a deep historical analysis of a sort of predicament that he identified, in this case in 1964, just I think in the run-up to the defeat of the Tories in the 1964 election. And so the attempt to trace this particular moment with its morbid symptoms, with all the sort of sclerotic, archaic features that he sort of, points towards, to put that onto a historical line, and to make the argument that what we're seeing now is a sort of rupture between sort of this compromise between agrarian industrial capitalism, between sort of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie that was forged in the 17th or 18th century, and that is now coming apart. And suddenly sort of, the political environment is still sort of distinguished by morbid symptoms, but there's an opening. There's something new that is happening, a potential conjuncture that can be seized. Now, more familiar to most of us will be the work of Stuart Hall, which in many ways sort of owes a lot to this type of sort of Gramsci-inspired analysis. And it's very easy to see sort of, how Hall's close reading of Gramsci sort of really permeates his entire work, but certainly also with the centrality of crisis in Hall's work, which is not a single thing, but just sort of, something that sort of he applies when he engages with different observations about society from the 70s into more contemporary times. So there is certainly an attempt to understand hegemonic blocks, social formations. There's also an attempt to draw crisis into the discussion of moral panics. His work on mugging, in particular, the development of populist authoritarianism, and then maybe most prominently with relation to Thatcherism and the way in which the conservatives under Thatcher were able to employ crisis in order to carve out hegemony and to create circumstances that is a challenge that he identifies that the left needed to emulate. At the same time, drawing out the contingency of progressive politics and the need for it to really emulate the cultural and ideological struggles that the right had successfully waged. Crises are also moments when new majorities can be constructed. Now, I want to just sort of draw some of that into the more recent present, because there is still obviously sort of a tradition of scholarship that speaks of conjuncture, that explores hegemonic blocks, looks for political openings. And I really don't want to be dismissive about that, but I think there is something fundamentally interesting about the role that crisis plays in these accounts. So here in Satnam Verdi's and Brandon McGeever's, I think, article was quite widely read at the time, pointing towards socioeconomic decline, class decomposition, alongside racialized codes of belonging, and kind of, post-colonial melancholia. So what I find interesting here in this tradition is in particular, I suppose, an inability to do certain things, to pay close attention to a number of sort of things that I think are really important to capture. Now, in the case of sort of conjunctural analysis that speak of conjuncture and then sort of point to sort of the multicultural everyday, as Gilroy and Bertie McGeever do, and Hall to some extent too. I mean, there are obvious questions about where this political force comes out of the everyday, out of these urban multicultural experiences. So how do we make sense of that? But I think there's something even more fundamental here about the conjunctural tradition, which is partially about the question of multiple and overlapping crises that cannot really be seized, that don't really strive towards resolution. And also lack of appreciation for the way in which crisis is a condition that is itself subject to narrative embellishment, that is worked through, that is sort of produced and reproduced. And a failure to capture crisis as a relational category. So I will sort of unpack all of these points in a bit more detail in the following. I don't want to lean much more into social theory, but the argument that I would want to develop if I had more time would be that so we need to also sort of, pay attention to crisis as a category of spectacular politics, not just of conjunctural politics. But I will leave that here. So what is missing in this work, in these traditions, and what I think is important to highlight, are a couple of key issues with regards to the productive effects of crisis. One is that crisis creates subject positions. It puts subjects into the frame of critical circumstances and suggests responses, usually, to the experience of crisis. It provides evaluations about groups, which are often so quite ambivalent, might include sort of moral praise as well as abjection at the same time. But it certainly tends to attribute also volition, impulse, and a kind of collective state of mind. It gives populations a form of coherence. Crisis suggests relationships, which often are antagonistic. So the crisis for one group is caused by the harmful presence of the other group. But I think it's often sort of even more complex than that. A lot of crisis commentary stipulates very specific response mechanisms about how sort of, groups interact with one another in a conflictual, antagonistic way, and suggest relational experiences that I think we need to uncover. And then finally, the point here is that crisis also creates audiences. So it's kind of not like in the Goffmanish sense where sort of audiences vanish in the background. I think crises are also, instances when audiences are summoned, are created, where they come into the picture. And I think there is something there even about sort of, rhetoric, speeches that employ crisis. Thinking here of Donald Trump's victory speech, American Carnage, where he sort of, really sketches out this image of American decline with reference to rusted out factories, scattered like tombstones, and then, other phenomena of decline that are sort of presented for visual consumption by sort of audiences that are kind of brought into the mix, into the frame. The visuality of crisis is something I want to kind of develop just a little bit further because I find it quite interesting. Not sure how many of you are familiar with the work of John McNaughton. He's probably the court painter of the Trump administration, quite a prolific person. Don't want to get into arguments about the quality of these paintings. But they apparently sell extremely well. So Sean Hannity, Fox News host, bought several of them for a lot of money. And the artist of madness himself, yes. But I find it interesting because in many ways, sort of the visual structure of these sort of images sort of mirrors the kind of more textual interest that I tend to have, right? About sort of how crisis works, how it puts audiences, subjects, and relations in place. So just focusing on one particular painting that here, where I think this idea of audiences also becomes quite tangible. Where, I mean, if you're looking here at the chains and the dollar bills spread out across the ground, where I think there's an argument certainly about the welfare state and about deservingness, about sort of the liberation of oneself from the shackles of the arrangements, but certainly also an image of the nation and its enemies, which are partially standing on the stage and in the background. So I don't want to linger too much on this, but I think it's just I enjoy that, so I thought you might as well. It's just coincidentally, because I thought that would be interesting. Here's a commentary by John McNaughton himself on this particular image, and about the coincidental whiteness of the forgotten man. But yes, I'll leave that here. J.D. Vance's book is also obviously a kind of rich sort of tableau of themes that follow similar templates. J.D. Vance, who's kind of claims insider status to the experience of kind of Appalachian deindustrialization and sort of dysfunctional family life and so on, was immensely successful in narrating his life story to wider publics, although he himself at the time of publishing this book sort of had an Ivy League education and work for venture capital funds, but it's sort of an argument about deindustrialization and decline, which is then channeled into an idea of cultural decay, vague idea of a spiritual crisis of community and culture and faith. Coincidentally, the crisis of the working class becomes also crisis for men. Proximity of such images of crisis, right? Not just in Vance's work of how kind of masculinity and victimhood kind of also sort of come into the mix here. I mean, that's certainly not specific to Hillbilly Elegy. And then the idea finally sort of, it builds up to a political crescendo where the political framing of these ideas of crisis, the appearance of Obama as a representative of the other, as a sign of the sort of that American meritocracy had conclusively failed. Now, all of this is sort of a bit remote, and I want to bring things a little bit closer to home now. And mention a couple of contributions in British academia and political scholarship over the past years that I think also illustrate some of these dimensions reasonably well. Drawing here on Eric Kaufmann's White Shift, on David Goodard's Go to Somewhere, on a book that Matthew Goodwin co-authored with Roger Eatwell, whose title I've forgotten, it doesn't matter. But it's equally kind of textual material that allows for this particular frame, looking at the way in which subjectivities of crisis are brought out, made tangible, the idea of discomfort with modernity, sort of the traditional inclinations of those populations that occupy historic territory, the idea of security, insecurity, and the resentment and fears that migration produces stand out here. But at the same time, again, I think it's sort of not just that, but it's also the relational dispositions that are interesting. The way in which sort of one subject is said to be, group is said to be in crisis, and that by itself then makes other groups as the sources of crisis tangible. in different ways. And then also this point about audiences again. No, I'm a bit too quick here and going through this material. I'm very happy to make a more precise case for sort of about these particular contributions. But I want to sort of make things even a bit more concrete with reference to sort of how these ideas, how crisis work sort of feeds into policy making, which is something that I am particularly interested in. I've kind of picked out 3 domains: integration, immigration, and education, and just want to sort of throw up here a couple of, quotes from recent reports that I think sort of offer a really good illustration of the way in which these ideas and images of crisis, have filtered into different policy frames. Now, can maybe make an argument about the political relevance of the Casey review with regards, it's supposed to be a review of integration, but sort of singled out Muslims in particular, and its various claims about cultural distance and segregation. But it certainly has sort of, reached into sort of policy making to the extent that has been picked up and commented upon, and continues to be sort of, the most dominant frame that is available for making, for problematizing integration, for suggesting sort of what the crisis is and how it ought to be responded to. Just recently came across this new briefing by Policy Exchange. It was co-authored by sort of David Goodwin with here Weber and Kaufmann as well, which obviously brings in different kind of proxies for Muslim distance, for the lack of integration, for Muslim separateness, which includes here even ethnic names, the persistence of ethnic first names as sort of a sign of cultural distance. And what that just reminded me of is sort of, the how encompassing this crisis frame is, how many signals can be sort of processed as critical when it comes to Muslim individual or collective behavior. Quite interested in this particular text, so policy briefing that David Goodwin also authored for Policy Exchange that came out in 2018, and sort of broadly anticipates sort of the framework that has been adopted since, but also sort of, suggests a couple of points that I find quite interesting, just for kind of set piece analysis of how these ideas about crisis play out with reference to immigration. And obviously of this policy analytic criticism of these images, of these texts, of how sort of society is made visible here is that's the kind of stuff that I do in this paper, I suppose. But where just a couple of things I find quite fascinating here, certainly when it comes to sort of subjects of crisis, the ambivalence of European migrants, right? So that they're neither here nor there status, the lack of commitment that they show to the country. Kind of reminds me of the ambivalence of the stranger when you think with Zygmunt Bauman's ideas. But as importantly, the relational dimension, the way in which this image of crisis also puts the natives into the frame as resentful subjects who are discomforted by this ambiguity, this ambivalence, this neither here nor there status of European citizens. And at the same time, how audiences are created through the spectatorship of such claims and such arguments about crisis. So in addition to distant Muslims, to kind of disembedded Europeans, it is obviously the construction of the so-called white working class that is particularly relevant here, and that has had resonance. It has become a very powerful theme in policy making, certainly in the area of education, where notwithstanding the fact that sort of many have cast doubt and sort of shown on the basis of data how unsound these constructions tend to be. They still sort of persist and shape policy making on the left, on well, sort of with Labour and amongst the Conservatives. Quite interesting to look at the development of some of these ideas in a recent report by the Education Committee, which I think is led by Robert Halfon, who is I think very much a culture warrior. And when you're thinking about the audiences here, right? So the way in which these ideas of the white working class sort of don't just serve an kind of function, but also are meant to sort of satisfy political objectives and allow for an appeal and sort of for the stoking of resentment here. So the point is that, you know, that argument based on the Equality Act that references to white privilege would be detrimental to white working class students. I mean, I want to sort of, I don't have the sort of the knowledge really and to go into more detail on that. It's not necessarily my area. I'm just sort of, you know, really a textual analyst of some of these claims and arguments and how sort of the notions, images of crisis sort of underpin the construal of the white working class. But I want to just bring in Robbie Shilliam's work here, which goes, you know, into so much detail about the lineage, the historical constructions that go into the way the white working class has been brought into being in the UK, and in particular the ideas of deservingness that go into that construction in a history of, you know, empire, immigration, and Brexit. And it also, you know, makes one important point that sort of brings me to the end of my presentation, which is, I suppose, about authorship and authenticity and the extent to which, in many of these crisis frames, you know, there's a complete denial of self-authorship. So crisis as a device of domination, and that's sort of part of the sort of brief conclusion that I want to offer here. First of which is to make an argument for the centrality of treating crisis as an active category, as something that comes into being, that does productive work in the, you know, spaces, in the political domains that are of interest to us. Positions groups suggest relational experiences and puts audiences into place. I feel uneasy with sort of the available tools in kind of theories of crisis that are there, because sort of the banality of crisis articulations, their circulation, their spectacular character cannot really be grasped with many of these sort of tools that exist. So that's kind of, you know, slightly more arcane conceptual argument that I'm making in the paper. What I haven't really been able to speak to in as much detail as I maybe should have is the place of history in all that, and the way in which populations, groups that are made visible through crisis also tend to be denied history. So the white working class is made visible through its grievances, through certain psychological dispositions that are attributed to it, not through its lived histories, traditions, or shared experiences over time. And I think you can make a very similar argument when it comes to the way in which Muslims are brought into existence as subjects of crisis. All of which leads to the important point about about authenticity and recognition to some extent, right? So the way in which such images need to be, you know, denaturalized, but also defeated and contrasted with ideas and images that sort of at least show some traces of authentic experiences. What kind of politics that would be, I don't know, but it's a good endpoint for me, I suppose. Okay, I hope this was at least somewhat useful for some of you, or at least provocative in some ways. And I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Jan. And in fact, we can get into discussion straight away because Nasser, and it's great that you're joining us, Nasser. Nasser's got his hand up. So go ahead, Nasser. We can't hear you at the moment.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Jan. It's really, really great to hear the paper, and I'm looking forward to. Oh, is that any better? Let's try that. Is that any better? Can you hear me?
Well, we started hearing you. It wasn't desperately clear, but it was better than silence.
Look, can you hear me now? If not, I'll log on to
yeah, that's better.
You can hear me now. Great, wonderful. Well, I was just saying thank you, Jan, for the paper, and I really look forward to the book. Not least just to read all the references that you worked through, which were really suggestive and sounded very exciting at times. I'm not sure if I misheard you earlier on. You were talking in passing. I'm not sure if you said affect or effect, but I suppose it brought to mind another side of crisis literature and crisis thinking, which is in affective politics. And you know, when you were talking at the beginning about using Susan Sontag's work, I was reminded of Lauren Ballant's writing of what she calls crisis ordinariness. And she very much calls that a genre. She calls that a genre. I think she takes that also from Sontag. And I suppose it's a question then in terms of what that adds to a prevailing normative category within the social sciences. Because, of course, Lauren Ballant is coming from the humanities. She's working in art history. She's working in literature. And I've tried to use her in the social sciences to try to narrate the story of racial justice and a crisis ordinariness of racial justice. But I am struggling to connect it with some of the more normative questions around equality, around identity, around notions of common belonging, which I can do if I don't work with some of the established literature. But when I'm trying to join the dots, they're not always commensurate, I suppose. So I'd be interested in thinking through with you how you can bridge that through an idea of effective politics, which adds to, you know, various other strands of crisis literatures.
Yeah, go ahead, Jan. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Nasser. I mean, that's excellent question. Obviously, you've just written a book length sort of work on Ballant, and I have only sort of very superficial understanding of some of the categories that she uses. I mean, for me, I suppose, the only thing I can really say, other than that there would be a really fascinating conversation to have, I mean, in particular around sort of in between humanities, sort of, I suppose, cultural production and cultural artifacts that have been kind of developed over time, and how sort of some of the tools then allow us to make sense of sort of the more political conditions and circumstances. I mean, for me, where there is, I suppose, in Susan Sontag and in other sort of humanities work, something really interesting about the creation, the production of affect, right? I mean, how it's something that sociologists, political scientists just tend to take for granted with regards to how subjectivities are lived out or exist, right? I mean, sort of this idea that all of these things also need to be looked at for the modes of production and for sort of the visual images and you know, that create experiences. I mean, this is at least sort of my very half-assed kind of reading of where there's a productive kind of link to some of the things that you said, but I'd like to pick that up maybe separately with you.
Thank you. Someone else like to come in with a question or comment on the presentation or something else in relation to the use of crisis? You do, Alex Roda. So yeah, please go ahead with your question.
Yes, hello. In the aftermath of the attack we saw in Buffalo in America, where it was motivated by this idea of white genocide, that the elites in America and other Western nations are deliberately trying to, what they call genocide, really just more dilute by allowing immigration in order to ensure political control. And given similar attacks of a similar nation in New Zealand with Christchurch and also El Paso, do you think, how exactly do you believe academics should respond to this sort of populist narrative, which very clearly is now leading into real world violence? And how exactly can you form a sort of coherent academic counter narrative to the polemicists that trade in such ideas of, you know, right replacement and its apologetics, you know, the Tucker Carlsons and the Eric Kaufmanns of the world?
Yeah, I have a very I'm certainly not qualified to answer sort of that question comprehensively about sort of what the most promising counter arguments are, but it seems to me that because I mean clearly you can make an empirical argument about sort of immigration histories and the way in which sort of the Great Replacement, which obviously hasn't just come up out of recent ideas that are in circulation in the English-speaking world, but I mean goes back to sort of, you know, French identitarian politics and have been very powerful in sort of you know, in that context for much longer already. What I mean to say, I suppose, is the way in which all of these kind of demographic anxieties, and I would sort of, you know, maybe draw a continuum there between yeah, exactly, Rena Camus, sort of spectrum between sort of different ideas such as sort of Muslim takeover, even self-segregation, sort of, and the Great Replacement and sort of white genocide ideas, right? Which obviously are not all the same, but sort of sit alongside a similar spectrum of sort of, you know, critical fantasies about Muslims and their demographic space, you know, place in European and American societies, which it seems to me are not usually subject to empirical arguments, at least sort of not when those people, for those people who hold these ideas are deeply committed to them, right? So, I mean, I think this is sort of partially response to what you're saying there, right? It seems to me that some of these ideas don't require just an empirical counter argument, but they also need to be sort of looked at for how they, again, put people into place. I mean, for the anxieties they produce, for the sort of the ideas of the relationships they suggest, for how they then, you know, those things resonate as ideology. But I mean, that's not a path-breaking suggestion or anything. So, I mean, if, you know, would love to hear more from you about sort of any work that you're maybe doing on this question.
Thank you. I'm afraid I'm not doing official academic work. It's more just sort of on the side projects, sort of calculating and compiling sort of various narratives that go back and forth in the media at the moment, I'm afraid.
Yeah, brilliant. So.
But yeah, maybe I could take up what Alex has said and perhaps kind of generalize it, so that it's not just about the crises that he identified, like white genocide, but I mean, some of the other crises that you mentioned, crisis of multiculturalism, crisis of secularism, crisis of growing inequality, and something very immediate, cost of living crisis. And so when I say take up the point, I mean, what I mean is, what, if any, you know, and that's a genuine question, if any, what, if any, implications would the kind of analysis of crisis discourse that you've sketched and the work that crisis discourses do, how does that analysis, if it does, contribute to engaging with some of those discourses. Because, I mean, for instance, crisis of multiculturalism and secularism, I'm engaging with all the time. So for me, the issues become things like, to what extent is what they're saying true? Is it based on evidence? And if so, what kind of evidence? And is there other evidence that they're ignoring, which would paint a different picture if that was to be taken into account? Also, the remedies that people propose for crises. You know, okay, they say there's a crisis of X, but what do they think should be done about it? Is that a reasonable thing to offer as a policy suggestion or a policy remedy? So now all that is working at what we might call, perhaps a distinction you'll understand, working at a kind of first order level. That is to say, it's working at the level of engagement and agency. You're offering an analysis which is a second order level analysis, which says, well, when agents talk like this, when people write certain kinds of books or politicians latch onto certain discourses, here is some of the work that they're doing. So how do you see a second order analysis of the kind you're working on contributing to first order engagements, if you do?
Sure, I'll try to respond to that. I mean, I'm kind of tempted to throw it back at you and sort of, ask the question sort of how in your view, how successful your various sort of responses to the claim that multiculturalism is in crisis. I mean, so there's not an argument about your lack of impact. I mean, certainly not. I mean, people widely read Tarek Moudud and sort of listening, sort of the way in which multiculturalism is consistent with sort of, the societies we live in, all of that is, I think, has a lot of potential to make a difference. So it's not kind of a denial of first order impact, I suppose. It's just that it seems to me that there is sort of a disjuncture fundamentally between, well, what in your case is the space of rational argumentation and of sort of first order engagement, and what I think is sort of, the domain of ideology and the way in which sort of, problems are narrated, created, mediated. So I think this is sort of, maybe partially a response to this distinction, where I don't think that separation is a necessity for me is that certainly when it comes to, let's call it kind of getting to the political or the normative, right? I mean, not just, embarking on a critical social theory of crisis discourse. I think there are sort of, there are necessary ground clearing steps that need to be taken in order to provide an effective response to the way in which crises are narrated or unfold, right? So if that makes sense. I mean, so say, so in order to be able to sort of, make claims for recognition, to engage in sort of, or to support the struggles of people who feel they are misrepresented, I think we are sort of, it is our duty to understand sort of, the structures and the ideologies and the motives that perpetuate the mischaracterizations, I suppose, right? And this is, I suppose, where you're then getting to the domain of your first order domain of engagement and struggle and sort of ideas and politics that are more familiar sort of from a kind of multiculturalist sort of engagement standpoint, I would say. So I think I would say, so if there's not an inconsistency as such, but I think so, and that's not a new revelation for either you or me, that I think that sort of, I suppose, that political ideas and discourses and images sort of need to be worked through and digested in ways that I think are necessary sort of for your project to be successful. But thanks.
So actually, we've got a question in the chat from I can't quite see. Is it from Anne Rule?
Got one from Catherine and one from Anna.
That's right. Sorry. Yes. So
I could take the one.
yeah, let's
order.
take them in order that they come in. So
sure.
Take Catherine's first.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's partially, so the question here is I suppose, goes back to this idea of crises as moments that can be seized, as conjunctural, right? So as openings in a kind of political space where actors then seize the opportunity to, you know, whatever, to set the agenda or to assume power. And I think, yeah, I suppose my sort of problem with that, I mean, I can see how that works sort of in historical Marxist analysis of sort of social relations and power struggles, and especially within a kind of Gramscian framework. But when I'm then thinking about crises as multiple, ubiquitous, overlapping, sort of mundane, right? So experiences that are shaped by multiple crises at the same time, and the kind of, you know, this feeling of befuddlement about all these sort of overlapping critical experiences that we're supposed to have, then I think I do wonder what, where the conjuncture is, where the opening is that can be seized. So, I mean, those are clearly not the types of crises that those conjuncturalists that, I mean, you know, Perry Anderson has in mind necessarily, but still sort of the toolkit that we need to have in order sort of to discuss the functions of crisis and the ways in which subjectivities in particular, this is sort of, I suppose, my key argument, are brought into being through this crisis work. I mean, this is, I think, where this focus on political openings and conjuncture is not quite as helpful, and where even sort of reading Stuart Hall in detail doesn't get you very far, which I found interesting, right? Because you're always thinking, yeah, he makes an argument about the malleability of ideology and the way in which the right was so incredibly successful in seizing the moment by sort of shifting the center and creating new subjectivities in British society. And yet there's still something missing about the way in which sort of, you know, crises sort of put groups into place and suggest relationships and do productive work that I think is missing. So I'm not as such taking issue with this idea of sort of, you know, there's a conjuncture and you know, morbid symptoms, so the whole kind of Gramscian apparatus, but I think there's something beyond that we need to understand. Sort of listening to myself and thinking that's not a very satisfactory response, but you know, that's all I've got. And for Anna, yeah, I mean, this is not surprising that I'm not talking about the cost of living crisis or the climate crisis or the climate emergency, right? Because, I mean, the materiality of that is probably exists at a different level than, say, the crisis of multiculturalism or the crisis of the white working class, even though in all such cases, obviously, there is something real that is intimated, but I suppose it's easier to get to the real, whatever that is, in the case of the environment and observations of climate change. So, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, obviously people are willing and engaged in discussions about climate change. So I'm not sure about this part of your question that suggests that sort of there's a greater willingness to sort of indulge in sort of the pure ideology of crisis as opposed to kind of real crisis. Maybe you would need to develop that or sort of tell me more about sort of what you mean by that, I suppose. But yeah.
Do you want to respond to what Jan's just said, Anna?
Or it could also be in writing, so don't want to put you on the spot, Anna.
Or anyone else like to either respond or take up something new, ask something new? Well, while people aren't responding just yet, maybe thinking about looking at their notes, I'll respond to what you said to me. Yeah, so I can see that there's a lot of difference in terms of what we might call, you know, kind of epistemological and conceptual difference between constructing an argument about evidence, based on evidence or evaluating evidence, and a discourse of crisis. I can see there could be a big gap. And certainly narratives about what the world's like, what the particular moment is like, or how we should respond to our circumstances, have a character which is not purely just to do with evidence and you know, reasoned argument. You know, it has to be a lot more than that. It has to capture a certain kind of imagination. It has to have a certain kind of dramatic quality. So would you say that the discourses that interest you primarily are more about what we might call socio-political narratives, you know, of which crises could be a very big subset, but it may well be that, you know, there are narratives of progress, narratives of how things can only get better, rather than just crises. Would that be closer to your level of analysis about the narratives of a political position? You know, like we talked about multiculturalism a moment ago. Of course, there's a narrative about the failure of multiculturalism, which can't just be reduced to issues of evidence. I certainly accept that. So I don't know whether that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, I mean, didn't really linger too much on sort of the crises of multiculturalism, because I mean, obviously there are existing ideological interpretation. I'm thinking particularly about the book by Gavin Titley and Alana Lanton, which you will remember, I suppose, right? I mean, which was kind of making the much broader point that crises of multiculturalism and the kind of the different nomenclatures, right? So the different ways, also in different national idioms, kind of pluralist arrangements and sort of legacies of, you know, different migration societies are considered to be unviable or in crisis. But sort of what unites those different points, according to Lanton Titley, is that they, you know, channel the discussion towards a dismissal of sort of racial injustice, I suppose, right? That seems to be the crucial argument they're making, as the denial, the rejection of multiculturalism is, I think they call it the relaundering of race, which I'm not sure about. I mean, because it seems to be a bit too one-dimensional and sort of, you know, so suggesting one particular outcome here. I mean, I suppose I'm more comfortable talking about the way in which particular populations are considered to be undergoing crisis, as opposed to sort of social political arrangements, which, you know, is sort of not strictly speaking what I was trying to work through in the paper. And there, I think it is in particular these sort of different, you know, beyond any sort of matter of fact basis, beyond sort of any empirical substance that might exist about sort of different groups having a rubbish time in society, it is sort of these ideological excesses, that sort of the stuff beyond that, right? Sort of that attributes just much more than just giving a factual description of, you know, a group's experience. that sort of draws on certain psychologistic models to suggest that there's kind of, this group has a particular volition, a disposition towards resentment, for example, in one way or another. This idea that there's a necessary relationship between sort of this group as it undergoes crisis and this other group, right? And the way in which, groupness, subjectivities are brought into existence. And that's, I think, is sort of the important point for me, at least. I mean, this way in which sort of spectators are always sort of brought into the frame there, right? So these kinds of things are not just happening as kind of interpellation, as attributions of certain labels or stigmas, but they are being done because they're being then read and are in circulation and kind of create almost like a nation building kind of device. So sort of Brexit Britain is being sort of constructed as a nation with reference to the crisis of the white working class and its problematic relationship with European migrants and other problematic others in society. So I think this is sort of the level of kind of, I suppose, critique of ideology analysis that I think is necessary when we're thinking about crisis. I don't necessarily think that there's any conflict with sort of a more first order engagement with sort of, misunderstandings and the issues that are there. But so it's more than that.
So thanks. Anna's just followed up in chat, saying, well, maybe you're more focused on an identity element. And just now, in a way, you talked about population or people.
Yeah.
So,
I suppose I wonder about how climate change, especially for how it implicates. I mean, I really can't claim that I've thought that through. And there's obviously really rich sociological literature that looks at sort of the questions of human survival and elementary vulnerability in light of degradations to the natural environment and climate change. And I really can't speak to that. But I think, it seems to me even sort of the politics of climate change is subject to kind of different narratives and denial or brushing aside and dismissals. So I mean, it's not a space that is free of narratives and ideology, clearly. I don't think I have more on that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah. Is that a new hand, Nasser?
Yes.
It is,
Yes.
if you can take it.
Yeah, we can, yeah.
So I guess it's just to pick up on that last point and really the conversation between you, and which circles inevitably, like every academic, back to my earlier point, which was that there is a bridge between the two positions in thinking about affective politics, and you don't need to see them in narrow kind of emotional ways. I mean, your description, Tarek, of the importance of the symbolic features of multicultural recognition, is what I understood you were describing. Was a very affective definition, in the way in which double consciousness, Du Bois' idea of double consciousness, a private world, a public world, reconciling the two and understanding your narration within an externality's attribution to you of maybe a negative position within society and so on, is an effective account. And it strikes me that you can manage those two. I've often been struck by the way in which, Tarek, you took the opening ceremony of the London Olympics as being almost a visual and aesthetic response to perceived crisis of multiculturalism. If anything, you felt to some extent it was a vindication of the kinds of first order politics that New Labour struggled to narrate when they were in office, and ironically it happened in 2012 when they were out of office. And there are elements of that too, I think, in what Jan is trying to describe. But it's just an observation whilst I was hearing you out with the dog, trying to catch up with myself, that actually you've answered in some respect each of the questions, if I may put it like that.
Thanks.
Nice to see a bit of Edinburgh too. Yeah. No, I mean, I can't pretend that this question of affect and how it feeds into the politics of recognition, or sort of, however you want to conceptualize it, sort of as a human desire to be acknowledged as one's authentic self. And I mean, this is sort of, I suppose I was kind of partially trying to speak to that when it comes to questions of self-authorship and the way in which sort of crisis, it seems to me, is a very important element of the politics of misrecognition, right? So the way in which subjects are denied self-authorship, are put into various problematic, resentful frames, you know, which might obviously apply in one way or another, but at the same time, they tend to be very reductionist, very narrow, and sort of limit the scope being challenged. And I think especially sort of this point about history is one that I find very important, right? I mean, how these different groups that are made visible as subjects of crisis tend to be denied history. I mean, they are sort of almost subject, you know, put into the sort of the flat present of resentment, grievances, conflictual relations with others. That's it, right? So the kind of structural conditions that brought those experiences into existence, they kind of tend to be forgotten or sort of, you know, only perfunctorily acknowledged. And the own sort of histories, I don't know, working class histories of kind of British Muslim life or whatever, I mean, they completely tend to disappear, which again, I think is one question of sort of authorship and recognition.
Does anyone else like to ask a question or make a comment? I think someone's just done so in the chat. Dawn Foster. Unfortunately, my chat somehow is not very easy to read. But anyway, can you read?
I can. Yeah. It seemed. I mean, I have nothing but admiration for Dawn Foster. so I'd like to see reference to her work, but I think I don't have a response to the point itself. Thanks, Alex, though.
Well, in that case, you have to hear me if no one else is coming in. So I wondered. I mean, you've. It's very clear from the last few exchanges, which one can then read back into the presentation as well, that, as you say, you're particularly interested in crises which identify problematic people, problematic populations. And you want to see yourself as working in a context which, you know, not perhaps directly, but indirectly derives from Gramscian theorizing, the conjunctural analysis approach. But of course, Gramsci's interest was in systems, you know, crises of capitalism. Stuart Hall is a figure that straddles an interest in, you know, systemic crises and the problematizing, the racializing, for instance, the stigmatizing of population groups. So I guess that makes me ask, is that distinction important to you? And do you see yourself as, I'm trying to see what how to analyze discourses or ideologies of crisis when they're a particular kind rather than the kind which we see in the kind of what we might call the late Marxist tradition?
I'll probably take just ever so slight an issue with your description of Gramsci. I mean, at least sort of my reading of his work, in particular, obviously the reception of his work, which in Gramsci's case is all the more important given the relative scarcity of his, you know, output beyond in the prison notebooks. I mean, clearly this is deeply animated by questions about sort of the stability of capitalist arrangements and the sort of perpetuation of capitalism through the the 19th and into the 20th century. But it's sort of bringing obviously a completely new apparatus of into the mix that was missing in Marxist orthodoxy. I mean, that's sort of the way I think about Gramsci, right? So this interest in civil society, in the war of position, in sort of, you know, hegemony, in sort of the way in which political spaces sort of are not just the dependent variable of sort of the unspooling of economic circumstances, but require, you know, strategic decisions on the part of sort of, you know, actors on either side of the political spectrum. And so, I mean, that's for me the tradition also, the Stuart Hall, Perry Anderson tradition, more or less, right? I mean, Stuart Hall, obviously a lot of other things come into the picture, but I mean, when you're reading his text, I feel sort of this is Gramsci is the key to so many of his, you know, writings. I mean, that's not any path-breaking insight. Now, in terms of, sort of my interest in sort of critical subjectivities and populations that are said to be in crisis, with regards to kind of the crisis of capitalism and hegemony, that's sort of one connection that I can't really draw on the basis of this presentation, I suppose. I mean, what I find maybe productive is to thinking about crisis as a spectacle, right? So the way in which we're witnessing one crisis after the next, sort of the ubiquity, proliferation of crises, and the way in which that might have a certain not soothing, but a function that kind of demobilizes people, that makes it more difficult to become an agent and to you know. So I maybe there's some argument about the way in which kind of crises and the proliferation of crisis as a spectacle kind of perpetuates the status quo. I suppose this is where I would kind of maybe be able to draw the line, not so much to Gramsci, but more sort of to Guy Debord and other sort of Euro-Marxist positions. But I felt that wasn't the challenge I needed to address. I mean, at least not with this audience.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jan. We've actually come to the end of our time with your last responses. So that's been very interesting to learn what you're working on, and that there may be a book in prospect about how to analyze the kinds of crises that some of us are very much well, that in many ways crisscross the fields of study for people like ourselves, like people at the center and in our areas of study. So I'm sorry that we are not now having the drinks reception that you identified as one of the highlights of the Ethnicity Center activities, a view I share. Hopefully we will be doing that on a regular basis soon. I'll be away for a while, and John Fox, who is, I can see, present on the screen, will be hosting the next few Ethnicity Center seminars. And I think John's aspiration, perhaps even intention, is that these should be hybrid events. If we can get the space and the technical equipment worked out and so on. And if people are now ready for hybrid events, and there's a kind of mixed evidence on that in terms of current recent experience. But in any case, we hope to be headed in that direction. And as far as you're concerned, Jan, some of us who will be present, look forward to meeting you in person in a few months' time at the end of September. And
we're having my own drinks reception now, just by myself. But maybe some other people, and I'll be thinking of all of you. So that's, you know, as good as it can be. So.
Yeah.
Thanks very
yeah.
much, Tarek.
I think we probably end up in that fragmented position. That's probably about right. And thanks to everybody who came today, and look forward to the next ethnicity seminar, where I think my participation will be online, but maybe it'll be a hybrid event. So bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.